November came to the Crown Heights Veterans Complex on Broadwater Avenue in Billings the way it always came to Montana, suddenly, and with the intention of staying. Jim Thayer had moved into apartment 4B 3 weeks earlier with one duffel bag and a dog named Atlas. And he had been planning to stay only until the VA paperwork cleared. But on the fourth night, Atlas had stood up in the dark and pressed his nose along the base of the front door, long, slow, deliberate, and Jim had opened it to find a covered plate on the hallway floor outside apartment 4C. Still warm. Roast chicken and something that smelled like cornbread. A folded paper napkin under the edge. No note. There was never a note. What Jim Thayer found when he finally stayed up to see who left those meals, and what it led him to discover inside apartment 4C, would uncover a debt his family had been carrying for 50 years without knowing its name. If you haven't found this channel yet, subscribe before we go any further. This is exactly the kind of story this channel tells, and you'll want to be here when the truth comes out. Jim Thayer was 34 years old and had grown up in Billings hearing his grandfather Carl tell stories about Vietnam the way other grandfathers told stories about fishing. The one Carl told most often was about a ditch in Công Tre province in 1968, a ditch he had fallen into when his legs stopped working. In the dark, with 2 men from his unit already gone and the third too far ahead to hear him. He had been there for 3 nights. 3 nights in a ditch in February in Vietnam, and then a man named Cole had found him. Cole from Billings, Carl always said. A carpenter's build, and a quiet way of moving, and the particular steadiness of a person who had decided, somewhere before the war started, that panic was not a tool he was going to use. Carl had come home. He had become an electrician, raised a family, told the story of Cole from Billings for 50 years. He had died in March, 4 months before Jim moved to Billings. Jim had been overseas when it happened. He had not been there. He had joined the Marines at 19 partly because of Carl's stories, the idea of men doing the most ordinary, extraordinary thing, which was simply not leaving. 3 deployments. Atlas for the last 2 years. And then, the summer after Carl died, a persistent and unfocused feeling that Billings was somewhere he needed to be, which he had not examined too closely because the last time he examined that kind of feeling, it had sent him to a recruiter's office at 19, and that had worked out reasonably well. Atlas was a Dutch shepherd, 68 pounds, gray-black brindle, with both ears fully upright and amber eyes that had the quality of collecting more information than they released. He was not a demonstrative dog. He did not pace or whine or bark at things. He processed, assessed, and acted. When he went to the base of the front door on the 4th night and pressed his nose along the crack, Jim had not hesitated. In 2 years of working together, Atlas had not once gone to a door without a reason. Vernon Cole had been 83 years old for 11 months and was not making a fuss about it. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne, come home to Billings, become a carpenter for 37 years, and built enough furniture over that time to fill the apartment 3 times over. Which was why the 2 armchairs, and the bookshelf, and the coffee table, and the kitchen chairs all had the particular solidity of things made by someone who knew wood the way Carl Thayer had known wiring. He had married Claire Marsh in 1971, and been married to her for 53 years, which was the fact about his life he stated most readily, and the one that still surprised him in the mornings when he reached across the bed. Claire had died 4 years ago. She had asked Agnes Hartley, in the last weeks, to keep an eye on Vern. She had said it the way Claire said most things, simply, without drama, as though the request were the most natural thing in the world, and only the agreeing to it required any thought. Agnes had agreed. She had been doing it since. Vern was thin in the way of a man who did not make a fuss about meals. He had always been lean, the physical type that doesn't carry extra. The type that looks like the work it's done. But in the past year he had gotten thinner in a different way. Agnes had noticed. She noticed the way a woman notices who spent 30 years as a school teacher and understood what it looked like when someone was getting less than they needed and not complaining about it. She had started leaving meals 3 months ago. She did it at 8:45 when the hallway was quiet, in her slippers with a covered plate. She had not told Vern it was her. Vern had not asked. His son Dale managed his finances. This had seemed, when it was arranged 4 years ago, like a practical thing. Vern had never been good with paperwork. Claire had always done the accounts, and Dale had offered. Vern's pension and his veterans' benefits amounted to about $1,900 per month, from which the building deducted rent. What remained was for groceries, utilities, incidentals. The amount that appeared in Vern's account each month had been decreasing for 2 years, in increments small enough not to alarm, $20 here, $30 there. And Vern had adjusted, because adjustment was something he had been trained to do. He had stopped buying meat regularly in March. He told himself prices had gone up. He did not know that 3 years of adjustments had added up to $84,000 and a name on a different account. He still polished his boots every Sunday morning. He had no particular place to go. He polished them anyway, because some things you keep doing regardless. The hallway outside 4C smelled, on 14 consecutive nights, of whatever Agnes had made. And on the 15th night, Jim Thayer sat in the dark outside his own door at 8:30 and waited. She came at 8:47, in blue slippers and a cardigan, carrying a plate with a cover she'd found at a second-hand shop specifically because it kept things warm. She stopped when she saw him. She was a small woman, 78, with white hair kept short, and the posture of someone who had stood at the front of a classroom for most of her working life. She looked at Jim for a moment, and then at Atlas sitting beside Jim's leg, and then she made the calculation of someone who understands that what they were doing was not wrong, but also was not simple. She whispered, "Don't tell him it was me." Jim looked at the plate. He looked at her. He said, "Why not?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. "Because he'd feel like a burden," she said, "and he isn't one. He just needs to eat." Jim stood up. He said, "Tell me about the food." She told him in the hallway, in a low voice, for 20 minutes. About Claire. About the request. About noticing 3 months ago that Vern had thrown away the end of a loaf of bread, not because it was stale, she said, but because he was rationing it, and the last few slices were for tomorrow, and throwing away the end was a way of not admitting that. A librarian, Agnes said, watches what people do with paper. A teacher watches what people do with things that are supposed to be plentiful. She had understood what the bread meant. She had not told anyone because she had not known what to tell or to whom. Dale came every few weeks and always left with papers in a folder, and Vern looking smaller than he had the week before. She had no proof of anything. She had a covered plate and a second-hand lid and 30 years of understanding what it looked like when someone was getting less than they needed. Jim did not sleep that night. The next morning, he knocked on 4C. Vern answered the door with the particular uprightness of a man who has been military and has not entirely stopped being military. He looked at Jim, then at Atlas, then at Jim again. He said, "You're the one in 4B. "Jim Thayer," Jim said. "I was wondering if you'd let me make you some coffee." There was a pause in which Vern appeared to assess him in the way veterans assess younger veterans, not for threat, exactly, but for substance. Then he opened the door. What Jim found inside that apartment would change everything he thought he understood about why he'd come to Billings. The apartment smelled like sawdust and machine oil, and every piece of furniture in it had been built by the man who lived there. The armchairs were solid and right. The bookshelf was straight and full. On the shelf beside the window, in a hand-built wooden frame, was a photograph. 4 soldiers in Vietnam-era fatigues. Young, sun-worn, somewhere in the middle of something that had not yet declared what it was. Below the photograph, in Vern's handwriting on a strip of paper tucked into the frame's edge, Cole, Odenkirk, Martinez, Thayer. Atlas crossed to the shelf and sat beside it without being told. Jim read the last name a second time. Then he stood very still for a moment. "The dog likes that shelf," Vern said from the kitchen doorway. Jim said, "Who is Thayer?" Vern came back into the room and looked at the photograph for a moment before he answered. "A man I knew a long time ago." He paused. "You look something like him. Have you ever known someone who kept a promise quietly? Who showed up every day for years without being asked and without needing anyone to know? If that person is still in your life, call them after this. If they're not, leave their name in the comments. They deserve to be remembered." Vern told Jim about the ditch. He told it the way Carl had told it, practically, without decoration, the way men trained to report describe events, except that he had never told it to anyone but Claire. And telling it to a stranger who looked like Carl was strange in a way he wasn't going to describe out loud. He described the 3 nights. He described what he'd found when he went back in the dark. He described the sound of the helicopter on the 3rd morning. He said, "I never found out what happened to him after that. I tried, 20 years later. Couldn't get far." Jim said, "Carl Thayer was my grandfather." Vern sat with this for a long time. He looked at the photograph. He looked at Jim. He looked at Atlas, who had stayed beside the shelf with the focused, unhurried presence of something that had located what it came for and saw no reason to move. "He made it home," Vern said finally. Not a question. "He made it home," Jim said. "He became an electrician. He had 4 kids and 11 grandchildren. He talked about Cole from Billings his whole life." A pause. "He died in March." Vern nodded once. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone absorbing something that has weight and must be set down carefully. Then he said, more quietly, "He used to say someone would come." He said it like a man who had stopped expecting it and was now adjusting to the fact that he had been right. It was at this point that Dale called. Jim watched Vern's posture change on the phone, not afraid exactly, something more specific. A careful arrangement that had been practiced. Short answers. "Yes, Saturday is fine. I'll be ready." And then he hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and when he came back he showed Jim the letter, as though he'd been waiting for a reason to show it to someone, and had not been able to find one until now. It was a guardianship petition, full authority, residential, financial, medical. The hearing was Monday. The filing gave Vern a list of facilities Dale had identified. None of them were in Billings. "He says it's for my protection," Vern said. What Vern said next was the only thing he had never said out loud to anyone, not even to Agnes. Because some things you carry alone until you find someone who already understands the weight of them. Jim left the apartment and went to Agnes's door. She let him in without surprise, as though she had been waiting for this conversation, in the way you wait for something inevitable. She sat across from him at her small kitchen table and answered every question with the precision of a woman who had understood for 3 months that she was building a record. She brought out a notebook. In it, dates, descriptions of what Vern ate when she could observe, dates she had seen Dale arrive and leave with folders, one specific entry where she had seen a bank statement on Vern's kitchen counter and photographed the total with her phone before the paper was removed. The total was not what Vern's pension should produce after expenses. Jim called the Veterans Benefits Administration that afternoon. He called Adult Protective Services that evening. He called a veterans legal aid organization in Helena that had been recommended to him by his unit's JAG officer 2 years earlier and that he had never expected to need. By Friday night, 3 organizations knew Vern Cole's name. Saturday morning, Dale arrived at 9 with a notary and a man he introduced as his accountant. He had not called ahead. He had a folder and the confidence of a man who had done this before in smaller versions and had not been surprised yet. He was surprised. If you were standing where Jim was standing, with what he knew, would you have opened that door and let them in? Type yes or no in the comments. I read every one. Jim opened the door to 4C before Dale could knock, because Vern had asked him to be there, and Jim was there. Atlas was in the living room. Agnes was sitting at Vern's kitchen table with her hands folded and her notebook on the table in front of her, and Vern was in his armchair with his boots polished, and the photograph was on the shelf where it had always been, except that now Jim knew the 4th name, and the 4th name knew why it was there. Dale walked in and took stock of the room. He was 58, the type of man who had learned early that confidence moves through spaces like a current, that people step aside for it, that rooms reorganize around it. He looked at Agnes with the expression of a man who has always found her manageable. He looked at Jim as an obstacle he had not anticipated and was already calculating how to route around. He looked at Vern, who looked back at him with the steadiness of a man who has been in worse rooms than this. "Dad," Dale said. His tone was warm and practiced. "Good. I was hoping we could have a few minutes before. I've read the petition," Jim said. Dale's warmth recalibrated. He set the folder on the coffee table. "I appreciate you looking out for my father," he said. "But this is a family matter," and Atlas moved. He crossed from the far wall in 2 steps, without sound, and placed himself between Dale and the armchair where Vern was sitting. He did not bark. He stood with his body angled slightly sideways, and a continuous low frequency emanating from somewhere in his chest. Not a growl so much as a register. Something below the range of alarm, but well inside the range of information. His eyes did not leave Dale's face. The notary, standing at the edge of the room, shifted her weight toward the door. Vern said, "He said I was eating too much." He said it quietly, not to Dale specifically, not to anyone specifically, the way a man says the thing he has been carrying when he is finally in a room where the carrying can stop. He said it looking at the table, and everyone in the room heard it. And Dale, who had said it to his father's face 2 years ago in this same apartment to justify reducing the grocery transfer, understood that everyone had heard it. The room went completely still. Agnes set one hand flat on her notebook. Jim picked up the folder from the table and placed it beside Agnes's notebook. The Veterans Benefits Administration opened a review of this account on Thursday. Adult Protective Services has an active file as of Friday morning. He placed a printed letter beside the folder. The guardianship hearing on Monday will include a representative from Montana's Long-Term Care Ombudsman Office, along with documentation of the pension transfer records going back 36 months. He set one more document on the table, a single page. The bank statement photograph Agnes had taken through a moment of fortunate carelessness. He said, "I'd like you to leave my neighbor's home." The accountant was already in the hallway. Dale looked at the table. He looked at Vern. He looked at Atlas, who had not moved by a single inch, whose frequency in his chest had not changed, whose eyes were holding Dale with the patient and absolute attention of something that had placed itself exactly where it intended to be for exactly as long as it needed to be there. Dale picked up his folder. When the door closed, Atlas walked back to the shelf beside the window and sat down. Vern looked at the photograph for a moment, and what Vern said next, about Carl, about the ditch, about 50 years of a debt that had finally found its way to the right address, was something Jim would carry for the rest of his life without once having to work to remember it. Cole, Jim said. What did he used to say? Carl, Vern almost smiled. He used to say that a man who doesn't make a fuss about getting help is the same as a man who doesn't make a fuss about giving it. He said those were the ones worth finding. He looked at Jim. He was right, as it turned out. The financial audit took 11 weeks. The diversion of pension funds totaled $84,000 across 36 months. Dale's access to Vern's accounts was suspended pending the criminal investigation. The Veterans Benefits Administration assigned a financial advocate. The guardianship petition was withdrawn. Vern's grocery account was restored to its full amount, and on the first Thursday after that, he bought a pork roast and brought it to Agnes's door and asked if she would like to share it. She said yes. He had bought 2 extra pounds because he thought she might say yes. Agnes stopped leaving plates in the hallway. She started sitting down instead. The covered plate was retired to the top shelf of her kitchen cupboard, where she kept things she intended to keep. By December, the 3 of them had fallen into the particular routine that happens when people stop being neighbors and start being something that doesn't have a tidy name. Agnes at the stove, Vern at the table, with a piece of whatever he was building that week. Jim at the window with Atlas at his feet, looking out at Billings in the snow in the way of a man who had arrived somewhere and was no longer spending much energy thinking about leaving. One evening, Vern asked Jim why he'd come to Billings specifically. Jim told him about Carl, about the story, about growing up with a Cole from Billings as the name of the best thing a person could be. Steady, without panic, the type who stays. Vern listened without interrupting. When Jim finished, Vern looked at the table for a moment. He never came back, Vern said. I always thought maybe he didn't make it. He paused. I'm glad he talked about it. I never told anyone. I didn't want to make myself a story. Jim said, You were already a story. We just didn't know where to find it. There are debts that don't announce themselves as debts. They look like a plate of food outside a door, a dog at a baseboard, a name written in faded ink below a photograph in a hand-built wooden frame. They look like coincidence until you stand far enough back to understand the shape of them. Jim Thayer had come to Billings with a duffel bag and a dog and a feeling he couldn't name, which turned out to be a name after all. Cole. A Cole from Billings who had stayed in a ditch with a man for 3 nights in 1968, whose address had been in this city the whole time, whose handwriting was on a strip of paper in a handmade frame on the shelf where Atlas still went first in every room they shared. Carl had told the story for 50 years. He had kept the name alive across every conversation about the war, repeated it to every grandchild, preserved it in the particular way of a man who understands that some debts cannot be paid in full, but can be kept current. He had said someone would come. The debt had not been forgotten. It had just taken one more generation to find its way home. This story is for every Agnes in every hallway, who keeps a promise without a name on it, who shows up with a covered plate and slippers and no interest in being thanked. And for everyone who has been eating less than they need and not making a fuss about it. You deserve the full plate. If this story brought someone to mind, a neighbor who looks after someone quietly, or a veteran in your life who might need checking on, leave their name in the comments. Let's fill this section with the people who show up without being asked. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.